Hi, I'm Nick Monaco. I'm a computational propaganda researcher at the Digital Intelligence Lab for Institute for the Future. I used to be at Google Jigsaw, and I am also an international team member of the Comprop project, the Computational Propaganda Research Project at the Oxford Internet Institute. And most of my work focuses on disinformation and bots and how bots spread disinformation both in democracies and autocracies. My latest publication is Computational Propaganda in Taiwan, where digital democracy meets automated autocracy. And it sort of explores the computational propaganda scene in Taiwan and both internal to Taiwan and also cross-strait relations. So, how mainland China uses computational propaganda within Taiwan to push its geopolitics. The Compra project and the work I've done has spanned a lot of countries. In this past year, and specifically in June of 2017, we released 9 case studies of computational propaganda all around the world: Russia, Brazil, Germany, Taiwan, China, the US, and a few other countries were covered in those 9 case studies. There's a really good executive summary written by Phil Howard and Sam Woolley that covers kind of a broad overview of all the things that we did. But that's just the latest release, or one of the latest releases in the Comprop project. It's been going on for a few years as a partnership between the University of Washington and the Oxford Internet Institute, and it's been looking into the question of computational propaganda and bots and how they affect polities, democracies, autocracies, citizenships all around the world. And This is really a problem that's been going on for quite some time. A lot of people are under the impression that bots just started happening in 2016, and that probably comes from the fact that they were being used at an all-time high. There was peak activity during the US presidential election and during Brexit. But bots really are a problem that have been going on for quite some time. I'd say since at least the late aughts, so the late 2000s, is when we started to see a ramp up in bot activity. So Syria is one of the countries we looked into where, for example, hashtag hijacking is one of the methods that's used, or hashtag poisoning. Basically, the Free Syria Electronic Army, which was opposing the Assad regime early on in the Syrian war, was using hashtag Syria to mobilize or to spread information that was helping their cause or anti-Assad. Pro-Assad forces caught onto this and started using the same hashtag Syria, with different purposes, either with pro-Assad content or with completely irrelevant content. So links to pictures of cats or soccer matches, completely irrelevant stuff that kind of undermines the effectiveness of the protest hashtag. And so that was Syria in around 2011. Mexico was another hotspot in 2012 with Peña bots, which helped Enrique Peña Nieto get elected in 2012. And 2012 was really a big year of bot activity and computational propaganda activity, specifically for electioneering. So South Korea, Ecuador, and Mexico are 3 countries that aren't dissimilar from the Philippines in the fact that giant propaganda apparatuses were being used to help propel people into office. I think the most interesting of those is South Korea in 2012, in which the National Intelligence Service was used to promote Park Geun-hye, who recently resigned as president. But this is when she was running for president. The incumbent party was in power. She was representing the incumbent party, but she was not yet president. And basically, the National Intelligence Services were recruited to start a propaganda campaign on her behalf and promote her being elected president. And I think something around 1.2 million tweets were spread by the intelligence services themselves, and both promoted her and smeared her opponents as North Korean sympathizers, and defamed them in various ways. And there's some various litigation going on in South Korea about that. But this was covered by the New York Times and several sources, but hasn't seemed to be covered very much in the West. So this is a problem with a long history. that's been developing for quite a few years, at least 10 years, if not longer. But it's definitely gotten a lot more media coverage most recently. So it's a great question to ask what's new with disinformation specifically right now. And there are a lot of answers to that, but I think the three main ones are the amount of data that we're dealing with and that's being produced, the speed with which disinformation can spread and propagate through networks, and then the scale of what's effective. So I can talk a little bit about all three of those. In terms of the amount of data that we're working with, the amount of data that's being generated is pretty astounding when you look at the statistics. So a few years ago, we had arrived at the point where we had produced more data than all of humanity had produced historically. And that fact couples with the fact that every few years, the digital universe, so the amount of data we're producing every year, is doubling. So every few years, we're doubling the amount of data that humanity has historically produced. And that's pretty unprecedented. So just some quick stats on the amount of data we're producing every day. 500 million tweets are posted every day, which is about 5,700 a second. 500 comments are posted on Facebook every minute. And about 400 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube each minute, which amounts to 65 years of video a day. So that's a pretty astounding statistic, and I'll return to that when I talk a little bit about the idea of do machines edit or shape our perceptions of reality. But this amount of data, what it enables in terms of social engineering, of targeting, of understanding people in terms of private and public surveillance, corporate surveillance, and being able to really target people with disinformation and micro-target people, that's very new. The second thing is speed. So obviously disinformation has existed before, and the United States has also engaged in disinformation, which is a fact that unfortunately seems to be forgotten in reference, in light of recent facts, but certainly in South America and other places we've been guilty of the same kind of activity. And a lot of countries have. Propaganda isn't anything new by any means, but the speed with which it spreads and the effectiveness with which it propagates through social networks is really something we haven't seen before. So now it is possible to send a message as fast as you can send a photon through a fiber optic cable at the speed of light. So that's also something new. And a third aspect of this is just scale. The Comprop executive summary that I mentioned before, which again summarizes the 9 country case studies that the Computational Propaganda Project at Oxford released this past summer, talks about the fact that propaganda has now been democratized. So it's anyone can megaphone a message, and they can do it as loudly as they want to if they have the means and know how to do so. But it's also truly possible to reach a global audience in a way that hasn't historically been possible. You could make a phone call to a friend, or maybe in exceptional cases a few friends, or you could send a telegraph before, but you've never been able to truly reach a global audience, truly reach billions of people with a message if it's effective and viral and insidious enough. So those are all 3 elements that I think contribute to the novelty of the disinformation phenomenon that we're seeing right now. So there's the question of how disinformation is affecting democracies and democratic spaces. And I think there are a lot of ways that democracies and democratic spaces are being affected, and a lot we can say on this question. So first I'll get into some of the negative impacts, and then I'll also talk a little bit about what I see as some of the positive impacts that are coming out of sort of this groundswell of disinformation that we're dealing with right now. I think one of the first things that's happening in democracies that's very concerning is this idea of manufacturing consensus. And this is a term that was coined by Samuel Woolley in his case study of the US and the Comprop case study that he did with Douglas Gilbo. And basically the idea of manufacturing consensus is sort of the same thing as the idea of what's called astroturfing, or fabricating online organic support for a candidate. So this is fake support for a candidate or a political idea that makes it seem like again, this candidate or this idea has more support and more of a groundswell of public approval than it actually does. And again, this is called manufacturing consensus. So this is something we've seen time and time again with Donald Trump, but also other politicians online. There were Latino bots in the Nevada primary in 2016 that were tweeting in support of Trump. And again, this is the idea of manufacturing consensus. So using this as a politician as a justification for your policies or your power is obviously a very dangerous phenomenon. It's also sometimes undermining the online sphere as a place for political opposition. As I talked about before, there's this phenomenon of hashtag hijacking or dampening, which can really undermine the effectiveness of political organization or political protest hashtags. At the same time, it's important to note that both can coexist together. So you can have a regime that is very propagandistic, very advanced in its use of online propaganda, and very extensive in its use of online propaganda, like, say, Venezuela. And you can also have a vibrant political opposition that's still organizing online and still getting its info online and using the online sphere effectively. And I think Venezuela is a great example of this. Freedom House, in its report Freedom on the Net, has noted this in 2016. And a colleague of mine, Douglas Gilbo, and I are releasing a paper on Venezuela that explores this a little bit more, propaganda in the Venezuelan sphere. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you get a chance. A third effect is that this, again, the swell of disinformation is sort of challenging the idea of a marketplace of ideas online, which a lot of social media companies tout as the reason that their platform shouldn't be regulated in any way whatsoever. A study on Brexit from Comprop, from Phil Howard and Vince Colagny, found that during Brexit they tracked a lot of pro-Brexit, neutral, and anti-Brexit hashtags. And the Brexit study found that less than 1% of sampled accounts were generating over 1/3 of the messages. So that's an incredibly disproportionate number. Less than 1% of Twitter accounts were generating over 30% of the messages on this topic. So that's something that's really challenging the idea of a marketplace of ideas online. And I think this idea should be questioned. I think we should know that bots can manufacture consensus. They can amplify a message, and they can drown out the ideas and the opinions of real people who have real things to say and important things to say. And all these facts are also driving sort of an impulse to regulate speech online, which I find very dangerous. And this is something that's happening in Western democracies as well, both among the citizenry and among legislatures. So you can see some liberal democracies or some members of liberal democracies sort of warming up to the idea of a Chinese approach to censorship online, the idea of content repression, which I find very dangerous as well. And another negative impact is obviously just a general confusion about what's true and how to get good information. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think citizens can do, in this kind of environment in a few minutes. But there's also positive impacts to sort of this examining of disinformation, this realization that it's going on a huge scale in a way we haven't seen before. So one of the positive impacts, I think, is that civil society and researchers are starting to ask questions about disinformation. They're starting to ask, how do we design technologies? How do we design AI with liberal democratic values in mind? And what can we do to avoid potential scenarios that are undesirable in the future? And I think there's really attention given to this problem now that hasn't been given in the past, and that hopefully will save us from some troubles that we might not have thought to avoid otherwise in the future. So Comprop, again, the organization that I'm a part of, Bellingcat, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, Truthy in Indiana. I think these are all really good research outlets that are producing good work, and Institute for the Future as well, the Digital Intelligence Lab. And I think all these, whether they're NGOs or academic research groups, are asking these questions and really helping to inform the public, academics, legislators, and experts and non-experts alike about what's the best way to embed liberal democratic values within the technologies we design. And another positive impact is I think effective pressure is being put on big tech to do something about this problem, which was not the case in the past few years before 2016 and before the public really cared about this problem. So this pressure being put on big tech, I think, will have an impact and will have a result. So those are two positive impacts I see in democracies and democratic spaces in the wake of this disinformation groundswell that's going. So a great question, after having acknowledged these problems, is asking what should ordinary citizens do? How can ordinary citizens not fall prey to disinformation? How can they fight disinformation? How can they make a difference within their society? And I think there are a few answers to that. And first of all, I think the truth is that the truth is hard, and I think it's important to recognize that journalists and researchers, they need time and they need to expend considerable effort to find out what the truth is. And there are errors in reporting, and there's bias in reporting at times as well. But it's important to recognize that getting it right is a hard thing to do, and it's a tough job. And even as a citizen, trying to be informed is a tough job, and it takes a lot of effort. So you should never assume that the truth will be given to you. You have to work for it, but it's worth working for. So what can ordinary citizens do to get at that truth? And I think there are a few things that will help combat disinformation. One of them is simply awareness, to be aware that these things exist. The Philippines is special because the Philippines spends more time on social media than any other country on earth. So it's important that citizens understand how it's used and abused for political messaging and persuasion. And there are a few things that they can be aware of that I think will help them just have a better idea of how these systems are abused and how to navigate the online sphere with a little more clarity, a little more awareness. And one is just to know that not everything you see on the internet is true, and not everyone you see on the internet is a person. Bots can be used to amplify messages. And censorship isn't necessarily only content repression. In this case, it can also be content generation. If a bot is amplifying a message to try to drown out another message, that's also a form of censorship, or a form of using speech as a censorial weapon, is how Tim Wu put it. And Tim Wu is a great researcher I'd recommend reading about, who works at kind of the intersection of technology and law. He coined the term net neutrality, coincidentally. Trolls can be used to intimidate or silence opposition elements in society, and bots can add to that too. I think another thing that's important to be aware of is to be aware that news stories take some time to be reported accurately. Don't assume that you have the whole story with one article, and especially when it's breaking news and it's very recent. So I would personally recommend On the Media's Breaking News Consumers Handbooks. They have tips for how to read news, how to react to a given situation, and they have them for different themes. So say terrorism, health, tragedies, mass tragedies, all kinds of things. And I think they have some really great tips on how to interpret news, especially as it's coming in and it's very recent. So I think all of these things are awareness. I think these are things that are good to be aware of and that help citizens avoid falling prey to disinformation. Some other things I think that are important to do. I think it's important to make sure your articles have authors that you read online. If you go to a website and none of the articles have authors, aside from, say, The Economist, which does that on purpose in a very conservative way, I think it's very suspicious if you go to a website that doesn't have authors for its articles, or if you can't find information on who that author is in real life. So that's something to be aware of as well. And research the authors, figure out, what they like to write about, what their expertise is. Make sure you know who you're reading and what their stances are, and that helps to kind of avoid falling prey to the fakest of news, libel and slander and things like that. Also, research a news website if you've never heard of it before. Be suspicious of Twitter feeds that seem to solely promote one website or news outlet, especially if it shows some of the signs I mentioned earlier of not having authors, or just being having stories published anonymously on the website. Another thing is to keep asking questions and keep researching your interests. Never assume you have the whole story. You have to always keep digging for the truth. And I think complacency can be a big problem here. Obviously, not everyone has the time for a research project, but even that minimal effort and awareness and knowing you don't have the whole story, continuing to read, continuing to try to be informed, those are all things that help quite a bit. And then the last thing I would say is just to engage on a human level with people. I think so. Social media is great as a tool for communication, but sometimes it makes us forget the human element of who we're talking to and who we're reading. So engaging with your fellow citizens, even in uncomfortable conversations, I think that's very important. So these are all things that I think ordinary citizens can do that will really help avoid falling prey to disinformation. It's a great question to ask whether machines edit or shape our perceptions of reality. I think that the answer is unequivocally yes, and I think it's necessarily so. Machines definitely do and have to edit and shape our perceptions of reality. As humans, we're limited in what we can experience daily through our senses, and obviously we can't see or experience the entire world all at one time. So necessarily, machines play a role in helping us perceive, helping us understand reality. There's just an innavigable amount of data that's out there at this point. So every few years, we're doubling the amount of data that humanity has produced historically throughout its entire existence, which is a really mind-blowing fact. So that's every few years, we're doubling the amount of stuff, of information that there is, that we've created in our entire existence to consume, to interpret. And I think that's really key to kind of what's going on right now. So you can call this the digital universe, the amount of data produced every year, and I think that's a great place to start. We have, again, 500 million tweets posted every day, 500 comments posted on Facebook every minute. By 2020, the digital universe will reach 180 zettabytes, which is 180 with 21 zeros after it, which is a pretty astounding statistic. And again, 65 years of video are uploaded to YouTube a day, so no human can process that information. It's just not possible. We need machines, actually, to triage what's relevant from what isn't. The question is, how do we do this in a transparent, reviewable, correctable, and fair way? So historically, we relied on journalists, on humans, on experts to interpret data, to shape our perceptions of reality and to inform us about what's going on. We will continue to do that, but increasingly machines will play a vital role in that process. And since that's the case, the questions are, knowing how it works, how do I get the info I get? How do the algorithms work that give me the news I get? Or how do the machines work that help me in my daily life? And how can these same systems be abused? And then knowing what's missing, what am I not seeing? What am I not getting? And how can I correct that? So I'll talk first about some examples of machines editing and shaping our perceptions of reality. I think the first is censorship. So traditionally, there's been a historical idea of censorship by content repression. If a government doesn't want you to see something, it will block it. It will take it off the internet. It will block the domain. It will filter it out. There's, in the past few years, with bots and amplification and trolling, been kind of a newer form of censorship, which I'd call censorship by content generation, and using speech as a censorial weapon. So there are a few people who have written about this, and quite compellingly. One of them is Tim Wu, the guy who coined the term net neutrality. He's works at the intersection of law and tech at Columbia University in New York, and he wrote a really great piece called "Is the First Amendment Obsolete?" on this question. Basically, the idea is we don't have a legal apparatus set up in place in the states that knows how to deal with censorship by content generation, censorship through speech as a censorial weapon. So I'd encourage you to read that if you have the time. Some other experts, King, Pan, and Roberts, they wrote a paper in 2017, exploring the 50 Cent Party in China. And it was previously conceived that the 50 Cent Party were people who were being paid to argue the government's political standpoints online, that they were contentious, acrimonious, angry. But actually, what the research found in governmental data leak is that the 50 Cent Party promotes cheerleading propaganda. So basically, the idea is to distract or to say positive things about the government, but not to engage in acrimonious debate. And again, this is the idea of censorship by content generation. And there's also worldwide state-sponsored trolling that's going on. I'm working on a paper on this topic with Carly Nist, the former legal director of Privacy International. But a lot of other places are doing great work on this too. Rappler has done some great reporting on trolling. IPI has done some great reporting with their On the Line database, which you can access online with harassment in Turkey and Austria. Global Voices has some cases coming soon in South and Central America on state-sponsored trolling. And again, I have a future paper coming out with Carly Nist that explores this question. All of this, again, is an example of censorship, which is an example of machines editing or shaping our perceptions of reality. We also have bots, which I've talked about quite extensively, but bots don't only exist, they occupy positions of substantial influence. And Samuel Woolley and Douglas Gilboa, in their 2017 US case study from Comprop, showed that not only were bots part of the election, but they occupied positions of considerable influence. So they really had an influence on how citizens perceived this election, and maybe even on how they voted eventually. And again, these bots, when they generate so much of the conversation, like in Brexit, when you had fewer than 1% of accounts generating over a third of the discussion, it challenges the idea of a free market of ideas when bots can dominate the conversation and amplify any message they want. So that's a second way that machines edit and shape our perception of reality. Another way is that machines can exploit users' vulnerability. And Ryan Calo at the University of Washington has done a lot of really great work on this. But basically, he points out that there's a difference between ad matching, showing people an ad for something they might be interested in, and exploiting their vulnerability. Using their interests, the data you can gather on them publicly and privately, to keep them online and to insidiously make them do what you want them to do, spend more time on your platform or buy a product you want them to do. This idea of the attention market. And there's really a difference between serving relevant ads on one hand and exploiting vulnerability on the other. There's a persuadability profile, he says, that is basically the vulnerability of a citizen. And where we draw that line is really important. But as more and more data is generated about people, more and more we'll be able to derive the intimate from the available. We'll be able to know more and more about people from the data they generate, what they do online, and this will be an increasing concern in the future. Machines also influence our reality just through these big tech companies' hegemonic and oligopolistic control. Facebook and Google account for 40% of America's digital content consumption, and beyond that, they represent about 80% of digital ad revenue in the States, and nearly all of that market's new growth. But in addition to the data and the infrastructure they have, they're building their own undersea cables to use for internet traffic, and only they really, and to some extent, intelligence agencies, and it's unclear to what extent, have access to the IPs and other info that would help understand propaganda campaigns and repeated offenders, the info that will help change these things. So that amount of control that they have necessarily means that machines are influencing our reality. And a fifth way is, of course, the topic of AI and everyday devices, the Internet of Things. Basically, we're ceding more and more everyday tasks to artificial intelligence and machine learning systems, and that necessarily alters our perception about how hard these tasks are, what they are and what our expectations are about what's possible. The New York Times expert writer John Markoff has written a lot about AI, and he's got a fantastic book called Machines of Loving Grace, in which he says repeatedly that AI is poised to have a greater overall effect on society than both personal computing and the internet combined, which is an astounding claim that he makes quite a few times. So it might not be 100% topical to the question now, but I think as time goes on, and as the digital universe expands, as we produce more data about ourselves online, I think AI will be a big part of the topic as well. And finally, I want to talk about some solutions to the idea that machines can edit and alter our perceptions of reality. Uh, a lot of these are sort of macro, long-term policy solutions, and I've talked a bit already about what I think ordinary citizens can do in the fight against disinformation. So these are some more macro policy, societal, private sector solutions that I think would help. Um, so what can be done about the fact that machines edit and alter our perception of reality? I think awareness is a huge one. Knowing how algorithms work, and making them auditable if possible. If people can come in and look at the algorithms and give their opinions about what's wrong, there will be several different opinions, I'm sure. But the fact that we can have an open conversation about that would be key. That would be very helpful. So, trying to be aware of what we're missing through the machines we're using to try to get a grasp or a handle on reality. And then another thing that falls into the awareness category is, again, what Rappler's doing in the Philippines, is spreading general awareness through high quality journalism and research. A few years ago, Andres Sepulveda, a Colombian hacker, confessed to working on digital disinformation campaigns and hacking campaigns to influence elections all over Latin America for over 10 years. And this was in early 2016. And Andres said, when I realized that people believe what the internet says more than reality, I discovered that I had the power to make people believe almost anything. So this gets to the core of the problem, but also the core of the solution. What can we do about this? We can change what people see, and censorship is an option there. I think it's a bad option. I think changing what people see could mean making sure all bots on Twitter announce that they're transparent. But we can also change how they see it. And how we do that is through spreading awareness, through digital literacy, through things like that. The digital minister of Taiwan, Audrey Tang, is implementing a digital literacy program in schools throughout Taiwan to teach kids how to spot a fake domain, how to check a source for reliability, things like that, but kind of updated for the online sphere. So digital literacy as well as media literacy. I think these are great social human solutions that can be used to fight this problem. Some other solutions I wrote about recently in my Rip on Foreign piece with Sam Woolley about regulatory responses to computational propaganda. Blue ribbon commissions composed of academic experts, private sector experts, and legislators to all get together to help everyone understand their blind spots and everyone else's point of view to try to craft policy that at the end of the day doesn't curtail liberties but does solve these problems and ensures that the internet remains a positive sum game in a free space for everyone involved. I think transparency of advertising online, which is being proposed currently in the United States, just as is the case on TV and radio currently in the United States, I think that would be a great idea. The FEC currently has no regulation on bots online, but I think keeping bots transparent, making sure, having a hard mechanism technologically to make sure that they announce that they're bots online would be very helpful. Beyond that, I think data sharing among private companies is a third way that would help. So if private companies can share data amongst each other about propaganda campaigns and also with researchers, especially on former known propaganda campaigns, I think that will vastly help our understanding of how these things work and inform our efforts on preventing and combating these things in the future. And And another solution is to continue pressure on companies. I think the current pressure on big tech is really getting somewhere, but I think they tend to be coy until they can't be anymore. So I think it's important that civil society, normal private citizens, and also academic experts continue to put pressure on these companies. As an example, Mark Zuckerberg initially dismissed the influence of Facebook on the U.S. election as pretty crazy, only later to disclose that 471 accounts and pages were linked directly to the Internet Research Agency, which is a troll factory in Russia, and he reneged on what he'd said before he rescinded his words. So I think that's a great example. Continued pressure on these companies really does have an effect, and I think we should continue to be loud and continue to be explicit about the fact that we need to keep in mind liberal democratic values are at stake, and we need to do something about the problem. And finally, I think any solutions to these problems, to disinformation or to machines editing and altering our perceptions of reality, I think these conversations and these solutions should be both human and computational in nature. At the end of the day, this is both a human problem and a computational problem. So I think the solutions should correspondingly be human and computational as well. One side or the other isn't going to solve all of the problem. So, of course, we've been in similar situations before. The invention of the printing press is quite famously preceded by, quite quickly, by about 100 years of religious wars in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And there are scholars who believe that information overload, the amount of new information available to people was overwhelming. That, at least in part, along with other societal factors, drove these religious wars. I think we're in a similar situation in terms of trying to process the digital universe, the fact that we're dealing with an amount of data that is multiple times what we produced historically in our existence. That's very difficult, and it's easy to panic and not know what to do. I'm an optimist. I think humanity is in a position now to face this problem rationally and to confront it with human and computational solutions. And it's going to be challenging, but I think having these conversations, doing great work like Rappler, and great research like the Digintel Lab and Comprop, I think these are all things that can contribute at the end of the day to solving this problem. So those are a few of my proposed solutions for what can be done about disinformation and the fact that machines may edit or alter our reality. So, spreading awareness, blue ribbon commissions, transparency of bots and advertising online, data sharing among private companies and researchers, continuing pressure on companies, and making sure that there's both a human and a computational element to any proposed solutions.